Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. Before we dive into today's story, I'd love to know where in the world you're watching from. Drop a comment below and let me know. The world Damien Vance had built for himself was one of polished surfaces and silent, obedient right angles, gleaming chrome, black marble, and vast panes of glass that separated his penthouse from the sprawling city below, a city he owned in more ways than one. From his perch atop the Vance Global Tower, the people were ants, their lives a distant, unimportant hum. His own life was a monument to control, to ruthless efficiency. Each morning began not with the warmth of a rising sun, but with the cool blue light of market data from across the globe. His suit was armor, his handshake a contract, his smile a negotiation tactic. 10 years ago he had surgically excised emotion from his life, treating it like a malignant tumor. He had become a king in a sterile, silent castle, and the silence was the sound of his success. But it was also the sound of a profound, gnawing emptiness he refused to name. He was in the back of his Rolls-Royce, the leather cool and impersonal against his tailored suit, when the world fractured. Traffic on the bridge was at a standstill, a rare inconvenience that grated on his meticulously planned schedule. He was reviewing a hostile takeover proposal on his tablet, his mind dissecting vulnerabilities and calculating leverage. A tap-tap-tapping sound pulled his gaze from the screen. He glanced out the armored window, irritated, ready to wave away whatever nuisance awaited, and then he saw them. 4 of them. 4 little girls, none older than 9 or 10, moving between the stalled cars with woven baskets of slightly wilted flowers. They were identical, their faces smudged with city grime, their clothes clean but worn thin. They moved as a single unit, a constellation of impossible sameness. But it wasn't their identical nature that made the air leave Damien's lungs in a silent rush. It was their faces. It was her face. It was Isabella, the same wide, almond-shaped eyes that held galaxies of emotion, the same defiant tilt of her chin, the same spray of faint freckles across the bridge of her nose, a feature he had once loved to trace with his thumb. It was Isabella, distilled into 4 perfect miniature versions, staring back at him from a past he had buried under a mountain of stock certificates and steel. His tablet slipped from his numb fingers, clattering onto the plush floor mat. The noise was distant, muted. The only sound in his head was the roaring of his own blood. He saw one of the girls laugh, a bright, untroubled sound that didn't reach him through the glass, and the shape of her smile was a dagger in his memory. It was Isabella's smile, the one she gave him the morning he'd asked her to marry him, full of impossible light. 10 years. It had been 10 years to the season since he had stood in this very city, in a different apartment, and watched her face crumble as he spat the cruelest words of his life. He had accused her of things he knew, even then, were lies fed to him by his jealous family, lies about her intentions, her background, her love. He had been so determined to protect his burgeoning empire, so terrified of vulnerability, that he had believed them. He had called her a grifter, an opportunist. He remembered the moment she had placed a hand over her stomach, her voice a broken whisper, as she told him she was pregnant. And he, in his blind ambition and monumental pride, had laughed. He had told her it was a pathetic final trick and had his security escort her from the building, from his life. He had watched her go, her back straight and proud even as her shoulders shook with sobs, and a part of him had died that day. He had just been too busy building his kingdom to notice. The girls, 9 years old, he guessed. He had thrown Isabella out 10 years ago. The math was a brutal, simple equation that settled like a block of ice in his gut. Could it be? Was it possible? The traffic began to inch forward. The girls moved on to the next car, their small figures receding. A primal panic seized him. He couldn't lose them, not again. "Stop the car," he commanded, his voice raw, unfamiliar to his own ears. His driver, a man accustomed to seamless, uninterrupted journeys, glanced back in the rearview mirror, confused. "Sir, I said stop the car, now!" The Rolls-Royce glided to a halt in the middle of the lane, earning a chorus of angry horns. Damien didn't care. He fumbled with the door, his hands shaking, and stumbled out into the humid city air, but it was too late. The flow of traffic had swallowed them. They were gone. He stood there, a titan of industry stranded on a bridge, the wind whipping at his $1,000 suit, his gaze fixed on the spot where they had been. The emptiness inside him now had a face, 4 of them, and for the first time in a decade, Damien Vance felt something other than the cold calculus of business. He felt a terror so profound it threatened to bring him to his knees. Sleep offered no escape. Damien's sterile penthouse, usually a sanctuary of quiet order, became a torture chamber of memory. Every polished surface reflected a ghost. He saw Isabella's face in the grain of the marble, heard her laugh in the whisper of the ventilation. He paced the vast, empty rooms, the city lights below mocking his isolation. The image of the 4 girls was burned onto the back of his eyelids. Their identical faces, so full of life, so achingly familiar. He had spent a decade convincing himself that what he'd done to Isabella was a necessary sacrifice, a strategic amputation to save the whole. Now, that logic crumbled into dust. What if he hadn't just amputated a limb? What if he had carved out his own heart and thrown it away? The next morning he broke a routine that was as ingrained as his own signature. He canceled his entire day. His assistant, rattled by the unprecedented command, asked if everything was all right. "Handle it," was all Damien said, his voice clipped. He didn't go to the office. He didn't track the Asian markets. Instead, he put on a simple pair of jeans and a plain gray sweatshirt, clothes he hadn't worn in years, and drove one of his less conspicuous cars himself. He felt like a spy in his own city as he navigated the unfamiliar streets leading back to the bridge. He parked a block away, his heart hammering against his ribs with a force that felt alien. He walked to the corner where he had seen them, the grimy pavement a world away from the manicured sidewalks of his financial district. He waited. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, beating down on the concrete. He felt the sweat on his brow, a sensation he usually only experienced in the climate-controlled environment of his private gym. He watched street vendors, listened to the cacophony of sirens and arguments and laughter. It was a symphony of life he had long since tuned out. He was about to give up, to dismiss the encounter as a hallucination born of stress and regret, when he saw them. They were walking down the sidewalk, not with their baskets of flowers, but with school backpacks slung over their shoulders. They were chattering amongst themselves, a self-contained universe of 4. He ducked into the alcove of a closed shop, his breath catching in his throat. Seeing them up close in the light of day was even more jarring. It was her. It was Isabella in every line of their posture, every flash of their eyes. He followed them, keeping a careful distance. He felt like a stalker, a creep, but he couldn't stop. It was a magnetic pull, a force of nature. They navigated the crowded streets with an easy confidence, weaving through pedestrians, their 4 heads of dark, curly hair bobbing in unison. They turned into a neighborhood that was a tapestry of faded glory and stubborn survival. The buildings were old, their brick facades streaked with grime, but window boxes overflowed with defiant red geraniums. The girls ran up the worn stone steps of a tenement building, their laughter echoing in the narrow street before the heavy door swung shut behind them. Damien stood across the street, staring at the building. It was a world away from his glass tower. This was where they lived. This was where she lived. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. He returned to his car and made a call. "Marcus," he said, his voice low, "I have a job for you. It's personal." and it requires absolute discretion. Marcus Thorne was the best private investigator money could buy, a man who moved through the city's shadows like a phantom. Damien gave him the address and a description of the girls. He didn't explain the connection. He couldn't. He just needed facts. He needed a name to anchor the ghost that was haunting him. While Marcus worked, Damien found himself drawn back to the neighborhood again and again. He'd park his car and just watch. He saw them playing hopscotch on the sidewalk, their movements synchronized and yet unique. He saw them helping an elderly neighbor carry her groceries up the steps. He saw a woman emerge from the building, her hair pulled back in a tired but neat bun, her face etched with a familiar weariness. It was Isabella. 10 years had carved new lines around her eyes, but they hadn't dimmed their fire. She looked tired, but she looked strong, resilient. He watched as she hugged each of her daughters before heading down the street, likely to one of the jobs she worked to keep them all afloat. The sight of her, so real and so close, sent a wave of shame and regret through him so powerful it almost made him physically sick. This was the life he had condemned her to. While he was closing multi-billion-dollar deals, she was struggling to put food on the table for his children. His children. The call from Marcus came 2 days later. "I have the information you wanted, Mr. Vance." Damien was in his office, staring blankly at a spreadsheet worth more than the entire city block where they lived. "Go on," he said, his knuckles white as he gripped the phone. "The mother's name is Isabella Rossi. She went back to her maiden name about 9.5 years ago. She works 2 jobs, a seamstress at a local tailor shop and a waitress at the Evening Star Diner. No criminal record. Pays her rent on time, every time. By all accounts, she's a devoted mother." Damien closed his eyes. Rossi. She had erased him completely. "The children?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Quadruplets," Marcus said, a note of surprise in his professional tone. "Amara, Brielle, Chloe, and Delilah Rossi, born 9 years, 7 months ago at City General Hospital. No father listed on the birth certificates. 9 years, 7 months. The timeline clicked into place with sickening precision. It was about 9 months after he'd thrown her out. The air turned thin. The spreadsheet on his screen blurred into meaningless numbers. Quadruplets. He hadn't just rejected her, he had rejected her when she was carrying 4 of his children. The weight of it was suffocating. "Is that all, sir?" Marcus asked. Damien couldn't speak. He just hung up the phone, the silence of his office pressing in on him. He had the facts. But the facts were an indictment, a judgment from which there was no appeal. He needed more. He needed the one thing that could obliterate any lingering sliver of doubt, the one thing that would make his new reality undeniable. He hated himself for what he was about to do, for the violation of it, but the gnawing uncertainty was a worse poison. He called Marcus again. "I need undeniable proof, Marcus, something concrete." The request was unspoken but clear. A DNA sample. It felt ghoulish, a desecration of the innocent lives he was observing from the shadows. Marcus, ever the professional, didn't question it. He simply said, "It will be done." A few days later, while Damien was chairing an emergency board meeting about the volatile European markets, his personal phone buzzed. It was a text from Marcus. "Package delivered to your penthouse. Lab results will be expedited." The rest of the meeting was a blur. Damien nodded, spoke, and issued directives with the practiced ease of a man on autopilot, but his mind was miles away in a sterile lab where his entire world was being decoded. He left the meeting abruptly, leaving his board members exchanging confused glances. He raced home, the city a smear of color outside his window. Inside his penthouse, on the cold marble countertop of his kitchen, sat a small, sealed evidence bag containing a single discarded plastic water bottle. a bottle one of his daughters had drunk from in the park. He stared at it for a long time. It was such a small, mundane object to hold the power to either confirm his deepest fear or release him back into his comfortable, empty life. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, which it would be. The email from the lab arrived the next afternoon. Damien was in his office, the cityscape spread before him, like a kingdom he no longer cared about. The subject line was clinical, Lab Report 734B. His hand trembled as he moved the cursor to open it. He scrolled past the technical jargon, his eyes searching for the one line that mattered. And then he saw it. Paternity test results. The alleged father, Damien Vance, cannot be excluded as the biological father of the child. The probability of paternity is 99.99999%. The world didn't fracture this time. It dissolved. The gleaming office, the leather chair, the skyline, it all melted away, replaced by the ghost of Isabella's face, tear-streaked and betrayed as he'd last seen her. He saw the flash of hurt in her eyes when he'd laughed at her pregnancy announcement. He remembered the precise, cruel words he had used, each one a stone he had thrown at her. And she had been carrying 4 of his children. 4. The number was incomprehensible. How had she survived? How had she managed to raise 4 children on her own for almost a decade while he luxuriated in his wealth, utterly oblivious? The sheer scale of his failure as a man was a physical weight, pressing down on his chest, making it hard to breathe. He wasn't just a ruthless businessman, he was a monster. He leaned forward, resting his forehead on the cool glass of the window, the city lights below blurring through his own unshed tears. For 10 years he had been building an empire on a foundation of lies and cruelty, and now the walls were finally caving in. He couldn't just appear. He couldn't storm into their lives with his lawyers and his checkbook. That was the old Damien's way. That was the way of the man who had created this mess. He had to be different. He had to be better. But how? How do you apologize for a decade of abandonment? How do you build a bridge across a chasm you yourself blasted into the earth? He spent days agonizing, researching Isabella's life through Marcus's discreet reports. He learned about the Evening Star Diner, the place she spent her nights serving coffee and pie to tired truckers and night owls. It was there he decided to make his approach, not as Damien Vance, the billionaire CEO, but as just a man. He chose his clothes carefully, not the jeans of his surveillance, but simple, well-made trousers and a soft cashmere sweater. He wanted to look respectable, not intimidating, not like a threat. He walked into the diner on a Tuesday night. The air was thick with the smell of fried onions and stale coffee. It was a world away from the Michelin-starred restaurants where he conducted his business. He took a seat in a worn vinyl booth in the corner, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He watched her work. She moved with an economy of motion, her face a mask of professional exhaustion. She refilled coffee cups, took orders, and cleared plates with a weary grace. Then her eyes swept over his corner of the diner, and she stopped. The coffee pot in her hand tilted, a brown stream splashing onto the checkered linoleum. For a moment she just stared, her face a storm of disbelief, anger, and a flicker of something else, old buried pain. He saw a decade of hardship in the tightening of her jaw. She composed herself with a speed that spoke of immense self-control, placed the pot on a counter, and walked toward his booth. Her steps were deliberate, firm. "What are you doing here, Damien?" Her voice was low, dangerously quiet, but it cut through the diner's clatter like a shard of glass. "Isabella," he began, his own voice sounding thick and clumsy. Can we talk?" "We have nothing to talk about," she said, her eyes like chips of flint. "We said everything that needed to be said 10 years ago." "No," he insisted, leaning forward. "No, I said things. Cruel, unforgivable things. I was wrong." A bitter, humorless laugh escaped her lips. "Wrong doesn't quite cover it, does it? Now, if you're not going to order, I have tables to wait on." She turned to leave. Panic seized him. "The girls," he said, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "I know about the girls, Isabella." She froze, her back to him. He could see the tension in her shoulders, the coiling of a fiercely protective instinct. She turned around slowly, her face pale. "You stay away from them," she whispered, her voice trembling with rage. "You have no right." "They're my daughters," he said softly, the words tasting strange and sacred on his tongue. "And you have kept them from me." Her eyes blazed. "I kept them from you. I kept them? You threw me out. You called me a liar and a gold digger when I tried to tell you. You didn't want a child. You made that perfectly, brutally clear. I didn't keep them from you, Damien. I saved them from you." Her words were a physical blow, every one of them true. He deserved it all. "Please," he said, the word raw with a desperation he hadn't felt since he was a boy. "Just talk to me, not here, somewhere else. 5 minutes. Please. Izzy." The old nickname slipped out, and he saw her flinch. It was a key to a door he had long since bolted shut. She stared at him for a long moment, her internal war visible on her face. Her pride, her anger, her protective fury, all warring with a decade of exhaustion. Finally, with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the world, she nodded curtly. "Tomorrow, park by the river, 3 o'clock. Be alone." Then she turned and walked away without another word, leaving him alone in the vinyl booth, the taste of stale coffee and bitter regret in his mouth. He was there at 2:30, pacing the grassy riverbank like a condemned man. When she arrived exactly at 3, she looked different. Not in her waitress uniform, but in simple jeans and a clean, crisp blouse. She looked like the woman he remembered, but stronger, harder. She didn't sit on the bench he gestured to. She stood, her arms crossed, a clear barrier between them. "You have your 5 minutes," she said, her tone businesslike. He started, the apology he had rehearsed 1,000 times feeling flimsy and inadequate. He told her he was a fool, that he was arrogant and cruel. He told her he had been poisoned by his family's ambition. He didn't make excuses, he just laid his failings bare. She listened, her expression unreadable. "And what do you want now, Damien?" she asked when he was finished. "To ease your conscience? To write a check and absolve yourself?" "No," he said, shaking his head. "I want to know them. I want to be their father." She scoffed. "A father? Do you have any idea what that means? It's not about writing checks. It's about sleepless nights and fevers. It's about packing 4 lunches every morning and checking homework every night. It's about being there. You don't know the first thing about being there." "Then teach me," he pleaded. "Let me try." They deserve more than this life. They deserve everything. Her eyes flashed with anger. "Don't you dare judge our life. We have love. We have each other. It's more than you have in that empty tower of yours." He flinched. She was right. "I know," he said quietly. "I know. But I can give them opportunities, security." "They have security," she shot back. "They have me." He saw it was the wrong approach. This wasn't a negotiation. He had to appeal to her heart, the one he had so carelessly broken. "Isabella, I look at them and I see you. And I see the biggest mistake of my life. Please don't let my mistake punish them too. Let me be a part of their lives. On your terms. Whatever you say." He held her gaze, letting her see the desperation, the genuine, soul-deep regret in his eyes. He saw the flicker of a thaw, the slightest softening of her rigid posture. She was tired. He could see how tired she was. The thought of sharing the burden, even with him, must have been a powerful lure. "One chance," she said, her voice barely audible. "You meet them, with me there. One wrong move, one hint that you will hurt them or disrupt the world I've built for them, and you are gone. For good. Do you understand?" He nodded, a wave of relief so intense it made him dizzy. "I understand. Thank you." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't absolution. But it was a beginning. The first meeting was a masterpiece of awkwardness. Isabella had chosen the neutral territory of the park again. The girls stood in a line beside her, 4 pairs of curious, identical eyes sizing him up. He had brought gifts, but at the last minute he'd left the expensive, flashy toys in the car, suddenly realizing how crass they would seem. Instead, he came empty-handed, feeling more vulnerable than he ever had in a boardroom. "Girls," Isabella said, her voice tight. This is Damien. He's an old friend of mine." The lie was thin, but necessary. He knelt down to their level, trying to smile, but his facial muscles felt stiff from disuse. "Hello," he said, his voice hoarse. "It's very nice to meet you all." Amara, who he'd learned from Marcus's reports was the unspoken leader, stepped forward slightly. "Mom says you're an old friend. How come we've never met you before?" The question was direct, innocent, and it pierced him. I've been away," he stammered. For a very long time. Brielle, the quiet artist, hid behind Isabella's leg, clutching a small sketchbook. Chloe, the bright-eyed optimist, gave him a small, shy wave, and Delilah, the fierce protector, just stared, her arms crossed, her expression a perfect miniature echo of her mother's. The conversation was stilted. He asked them about school. They gave one-word answers. He felt like an alien trying to communicate with a new species. The 30 minutes felt like 3 hours. When it was over and he watched them walk away, their small hands tucked safely in their mother's, he felt a profound sense of failure. But as he turned to leave, he heard a small voice. "Mister?" It was Chloe, who had run back a few steps. "You have sad eyes," she said simply, before turning and running to catch up with her family. He stood rooted to the spot, her childish observation more astute than any analysis from his team of executives. She was right. He did have sad eyes. And for the first time, he felt a flicker of hope that one day they might not be. Damien knew that grand gestures and expensive gifts would only push Isabella further away. He had to earn his place, inch by painstaking inch. He started small. He found out which grocery store Isabella used and arranged for her bill to be paid anonymously for the next year. He had a top-of-the-line heating and air conditioning unit delivered to her apartment building, a landlord-sponsored upgrade to replace the ancient rattling window units. These were things he could do from a distance, acts of service that eased her burden without crowding her pride. But the real work was in person. He kept his visits to the park, always on Isabella's terms. He learned to stop talking about himself and just listen. He learned the distinct personalities that lay beneath their identical faces. Amara was the pragmatic one, the little general who organized their games. Brielle was the dreamer, always with a sketchbook, her eyes seeing a world of color and shape that others missed. Chloe was the heart of the group, full of boundless optimism and quick to offer a hug. And Delilah was the sentinel, watchful and quiet, her trust the hardest to earn. He started bringing them things, but they were thoughtful, not extravagant. For Brielle, a set of professional-grade charcoal pencils. For Chloe, a book about rescued animals. For Amara, a complex puzzle that challenged her sharp mind. For Delilah, he struggled until one day he saw her admiring a small, tough-looking plant in a shop window. The next time he came, he brought her a bonsai tree, explaining that it was small but incredibly strong and resilient, just like her. He saw the flicker of a smile on her face, and it felt like winning a billion-dollar contract. He was learning their language. The breakthrough came on a gray Saturday afternoon. He had offered to take them to the city's largest playground, a sprawling wonderland of slides and swings that their small neighborhood park couldn't compete with. Isabella, surprisingly, agreed. She watched from a bench, a hawk guarding her chicks, as he tentatively joined their games. He pushed them on the swings, his arms aching, his laughter rusty but genuine. He helped them build a teetering sandcastle, getting sand in his expensive shoes and not caring in the slightest. He was discovering muscles in his face, smiling muscles that had atrophied over the years. As the afternoon wore on, the sky darkened ominously. A sudden summer storm rolled in, the clouds turning a bruised purple. The first fat drops of rain sent families scattering. A loud clap of thunder cracked overhead, and Damien saw Delilah flinch, her small body trembling. The rain began to fall in earnest, a cold, driving sheet. They were too far from the car. "This way," he yelled, spotting a large wooden gazebo in the center of the park. He herded the girls toward it, their small hands in his. They huddled together under the roof as the storm raged around them, the wind whipping rain into their small sanctuary. Delilah was crying now, silent tears tracking through the grime on her cheeks as another boom of thunder echoed. Without thinking, without calculating, Damien acted on pure instinct. He took off his expensive jacket, a cashmere blend that cost more than Isabella's monthly rent, and wrapped it around all four of them, pulling them into a tight circle against him. "It's all right," he said, his voice low and steady. "It's just noise. It can't hurt us in here." He held them close, their small, trembling bodies pressing against him. He could feel their heartbeats, fast and fluttery, like trapped birds. He started telling them a story, a silly, rambling tale his own father used to tell him about a friendly giant who was afraid of mice. He lost track of time, his voice a low murmur against the drumming of the rain. Eventually he felt Delilah's trembling subside. Chloe rested her head against his chest. Brielle was watching him with wide, curious eyes. Amara, ever the practical one, was examining the stitching on his jacket. He looked up and met Isabella's gaze. She was standing at the edge of the gazebo, soaked but unmoving, and the look on her face was one he hadn't seen in 10 years. The anger was gone. The suspicion was gone. In its place was a fragile, hesitant warmth. In that small, storm-battered gazebo, huddled together against the thunder, something had shifted. He wasn't the billionaire. He wasn't the stranger. He was just Damien, a man shielding his children from a storm. And for the first time, it felt like he was finally home. The change in Damien Vance did not go unnoticed. At Vance Global, his newfound distraction was becoming a liability. He was leaving meetings early. He was delegating major decisions he would have once micromanaged to death. His mind, once a steel trap for market fluctuations and competitor weaknesses, was now filled with the memory of 4 different laughs, the feel of 4 small hands in his. This change was most acutely observed by Genevieve Croft. A senior board member with an office just down the hall from Damien's, Genevieve was a woman carved from the same ambitious stone as the old Damien. She was sharp, ruthless, and had been his fiancée for a brief calculated period years ago, a merger of power and influence that had ended abruptly when Damien met Isabella. Genevieve had never forgiven Isabella for that, nor had she ever fully relinquished her sense of claim over Damien and the empire he commanded. She was the primary architect of the impending Kressler-Dunn merger, a colossal deal that would cement Vance Global's dominance for a generation and secure her own legacy. Damien's sudden erratic behavior was a threat to her life's work. "He's unfocused," she complained to another board member over lunch at a restaurant where a single plate cost more than Isabella's weekly groceries. "He's drifting. Something's wrong." She decided to take matters into her own hands. She hired her own private investigator, a far less scrupulous character than Marcus Thorne, with a simple directive: find out what or who was distracting Damien Vance. The investigator was efficient. Within a week, a thick manila envelope landed on Genevieve's mahogany desk. Inside were photographs, grainy long-lens shots of Damien Vance, the titan of industry, on his knees in the sand at a public playground. Damien Vance buying 4 identical pink backpacks. Damien Vance standing outside a run-down tenement building, his face lit with a soft, unfamiliar expression. And then the money shot. Damien with the 4 little girls and a woman. A woman whose face, though older and more tired, was unmistakably Isabella Rossi. Genevieve stared at the photographs, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the glossy prints. The resemblance between the children and Isabella was undeniable, and worse, the resemblance to a younger Damien was there too, in the stubborn set of their jaws, in the intensity of their eyes. She did the math. She remembered when Isabella had vanished, 9-10 years ago. It all clicked into place with horrifying clarity. These weren't just some charity case Damien had taken on. These were his children, Isabella's children. Genevieve felt a cold fury rise within her. She saw not a family, but an infestation, a blight on the pristine, powerful world she had helped build. These street urchins and their pathetic mother were a threat to the merger, to the company's image, and to her own position. They were a link to a past of emotion and weakness that Damien had supposedly excised. They had to be dealt with. Genevieve's first move was subtle. She cornered Damien in the hallway after a board meeting. "Damien, darling," she said, her voice dripping with manufactured concern, "we're all a bit worried about you. You seem distant. With the Kressler-Dunn deal at such a critical stage, we need you at your best." "I'm fine, Genevieve," he said, his tone dismissive. He was already thinking about a promise he'd made to the girls to visit the Science Museum. "Are you?" she pressed, her eyes glinting. "Because I hear you've been spending a lot of time in a part of town not exactly known for its business opportunities. I hope you're not getting tangled in something messy." Damien froze. He turned to face her, his easy-going paternal facade dropping away to reveal the cold predator he used to be. "My personal life is not a topic for boardroom discussion, Genevieve. Stay out of it." Her smile was thin, sharp. "Of course. It's just that secrets have a way of becoming liabilities, especially when they're 9 years old and identical." The blood drained from Damien's face. He knew. Somehow, she knew. The threat was clear. He had to end this. He had to protect them. But Genevieve was faster. She didn't need to fight Damien directly. She was a master of collateral damage. She made a single anonymous phone call to a notorious online gossip columnist she kept on a retainer for just such occasions. She fed him the story, spinning it with practiced malice. She painted Isabella as a conniving woman from the past who had resurfaced with 4 children of questionable paternity, perfectly timed to extort the billionaire on the eve of his biggest deal. She provided the photographs, which were published under the blaring headline, "Billionaire CEO's Secret Poverty Family, a Decade-Long Deception?" The story exploded online. It was a perfect storm of wealth, poverty, and scandal. By morning, Isabella's quiet, anonymous life was over. A swarm of paparazzi descended on her street like vultures. Cameras flashed in the girls' faces as they tried to leave for school. Aggressive reporters shouted questions at Isabella, their words echoing Genevieve's poisonous narrative. "Are they really his? How much is he paying you to stay quiet? Are you a gold digger?" The girls were terrified. Amara tried to shield her sisters, while Delilah kicked at a cameraman who got too close. They ran back inside, their sanctuary now a prison. Isabella, her face a mask of white-hot fury and humiliation, slammed and bolted the door. The world she had so carefully and fiercely protected for a decade had been shattered in an instant. Her first call was to Damien. Her voice was not hurt or sad. It was pure, unadulterated rage. "This is your world, Damien," she spat into the phone. "This is what you bring with you. Chaos, vultures. You promised you wouldn't hurt them. You lied. Stay away from us. Stay away and never come back. You've ruined everything." The line went dead, leaving Damien standing in the silence of his penthouse, the accusatory words ringing in his ears. He had tried to build a bridge, but he had only led the monsters from his world across it, right to their doorstep. The explosion in the media sent shock waves through the financial world. The board of Kressler-Dunn, a notoriously conservative company, was spooked. The scandal, with its undertones of illegitimacy and extortion, threatened to poison the merger. Damien's phone rang incessantly, lawyers, PR experts, board members, all demanding he handle the situation. Genevieve, playing the part of the concerned colleague, led the charge. She called an emergency meeting of the Vance Global Board. "This is a catastrophe," she announced to the assembled members, her voice ringing with false gravity. "Our stock is wavering. Kressler-Dunn is threatening to pull out. Damien's personal entanglement has become a multi-billion-dollar liability." She let that sink in before delivering the killing blow. The only way to salvage this deal is for Damien to issue a swift public statement. He needs to denounce this woman and her claims. He needs to create distance, question the children's paternity, and promise a thorough private investigation after the merger is complete. He must choose the company over this distraction. The board murmured in agreement. It was brutal, but it was business. All eyes turned to Damien, who sat at the head of the table, his face like stone. His world was collapsing from two sides. On one side, the culmination of his life's work, the deal that would define his legacy. On the other, a furious, heartbroken woman and 4 terrified little girls who he had just begun to love. He felt Isabella's words like a brand on his soul. "Stay away from us." Maybe she was right. Maybe he was a force of destruction. Maybe the kindest thing he could do was to cut them loose, to take the board's advice and retreat back into his gilded cage, leaving them to their peace, however hard-won. His PR chief was already drafting a statement on a laptop in the corner, its words cold and clinical, surgically removing him from the messy reality of fatherhood. His phone vibrated on the polished table. A private number. He almost ignored it, but some instinct made him answer. "Hello? Damien?" It was Isabella. Her voice was no longer angry. It was tight with panic. "It's Chloe. She can't breathe. I think it's an asthma attack. All the stress, the flashing lights. She's never been this bad. The ambulance is taking forever. I don't know what to do." In that instant, the boardroom, the merger, the billions of dollars, it all evaporated. The noise in his head went silent, replaced by a single clarion thought, "My daughter needs me." There was no choice to be made. There was never a choice. "Where are you?" he asked, his voice calm and commanding. She gave him the address of the nearest hospital. "I'm on my way," he said. He stood up, his chair scraping against the marble floor. The boardroom fell silent. "Damien, what are you doing?" Genevieve demanded, her eyes wide with alarm. "The Kressler-Dunn call is in 5 minutes." He looked at her, and for the first time, he saw her not as a rival or a colleague, but as the embodiment of the empty world he was leaving behind. "The deal is off," he said, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "My family comes first." He turned and walked out of the room, leaving behind a stunned board and the ruins of a $10 billion merger, and he didn't look back once. He drove like a madman, weaving through the city traffic that now seemed like a personal affront. He called the hospital on his hands-free system, not as a panicked father, but as Damian Vance, the man who owned half the city. He demanded the chief of pediatrics meet him in the emergency room, that a private suite be prepared, that every resource be made available. He was using his power, the very thing that had caused this disaster, but now he was using it as a shield, not a weapon. He burst into the emergency room and found them in a crowded, chaotic waiting area. Isabella was holding a wheezing Chloe, her face a mask of terror. The other 3 girls were huddled around her, their faces pale with fear. He strode toward them, and for a second he saw Isabella flinch, ready for a fight. But then she saw his face, the raw panic and purpose in his eyes, and something in her gave way. A team of doctors, spurred by his call, descended on them immediately, whisking Chloe into a private treatment room. Damian took charge. He spoke to the doctors, his questions sharp and precise. He shielded Isabella and the other girls from the chaos, his large frame a bulwark against the noise and fear of the ER. He sat with Amara, Brielle, and Delilah in the waiting room, holding their hands, telling them that their sister was strong and that the best doctors in the city were helping her. He was no longer the awkward stranger. He was their father. When the doctor finally emerged to say Chloe was stable, that the attack was under control, Damian felt a wave of relief so profound it nearly buckled his knees. He went to Chloe's room and found Isabella sitting by the bed, holding her daughter's small hand. Chloe was sleeping, a small oxygen mask over her face. "Thank you," Isabella whispered, her voice thick with tears. She looked at him, her eyes filled with a decade of unspoken emotions. "I was so scared." "I know," he said softly, putting a hand on her shoulder. "But you're not alone anymore." In that quiet hospital room, a silent truce was declared. The war was over, but Damian knew his work wasn't done. He had one last battle to fight. He left Isabella with the girls, promising to return soon. He walked out of the hospital and into the flashbulbs of the paparazzi who had already tracked him there. But this time he didn't flee. He walked straight toward them. "You want a story?" he said, his voice booming over their shouted questions. "There will be a press conference at the Vance Tower in 1 hour. You'll get your story." An hour later, Damian Vance stood at a podium, the world's media before him. Genevieve and the board were watching on every news channel, expecting him to execute the damage control they had demanded. He looked into the cameras, but he wasn't speaking to the reporters or the investors. He was speaking to Isabella, to his daughters. "An hour ago," he began, his voice steady, "I walked away from the largest business deal of my life. I did it because my daughter was in the hospital and she needed me. For the last 10 years, I have made my company my only priority. I have sacrificed everything for it, including the only woman I have ever loved, Isabella Rossi." A gasp went through the room. 10 years ago, out of pride and foolishness, I sent her away. What I did not know, what I refused to let myself know, was that she was pregnant with our children. For 9 years, she raised our 4 incredible daughters, Amara, Brielle, Chloe, and Delilah, on her own. She gave them a life full of love and integrity, while I lived in an empty palace of my own making. I am here today not to deny them, but to claim them as the greatest assets I will ever have. He then turned his attention to the scandal. The malicious rumors leaked to the press were a deliberate attempt to sabotage not just my family, but this company. They were leaked by a member of my own board. He motioned to his head of security, who projected a document onto the screen behind him. It was a record of the phone call from Genevieve's office to the gossip columnist. Effective immediately, Genevieve Croft is removed from the board of Vance Global and all its subsidiaries. He had won. He had used the full crushing weight of his power not to build his empire, but to protect his family. He had chosen them unequivocally and publicly over everything else. In her hospital room, Isabella watched the press conference on the small TV, tears streaming down her face. They weren't tears of anger or sadness. They were tears of release. The man she had once loved, the man she had hated, the man she had feared, he was finally the man she always knew he could be. 1 year later, the sterile, glass-walled penthouse was gone, sold to a tech mogul who loved its cold emptiness. The Vance family now lived in a sprawling, warm home in the green suburbs, a house with a huge backyard and scuff marks on the hardwood floors. On a sun-drenched Saturday afternoon, Damien was on his hands and knees in the grass, his eyes squeezed shut, while 4 pairs of hands clumsily tried to braid the few inches of hair he had. "It needs a bow, Dyke," Chloe declared. "No, glitter," insisted Brielle. He was laughing, a deep, genuine sound that echoed in the open air. Isabella came out of the back door carrying a tray of lemonade and cookies. She smiled, watching the scene. He looked up and his eyes met hers, a silent conversation passing between them that spoke of shared nights, lazy mornings, and the beautiful, chaotic peace they had built together. He had renegotiated the Kressler-Dunn merger on his own terms, from a position of unassailable strength, but the victory felt secondary now. His true legacy was rolling around in the grass, covered in glitter and demanding a pony. Isabella set the tray down and sat beside him, leaning her head on his shoulder. He wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. The 4 girls abandoned his hair and swarmed them both in a massive group hug. As Damien looked at the 5 faces surrounding him, the 5 beating hearts of his world, he knew he was finally truly the richest man alive. He was home.